He's finally closing in on Daesh-inspired terrorism. Donald Trump tells his pal Piers Morgan that he's not a racist, just a big bundle of common sense. What do you think? IDS has set the cat among the pigeons with his resignation. How long will George Osborne last now that the Prime Minister has declared full confidence in his Chancellor? And disability campaigners continue their protest in the Commons, but should they have been left out in the cold? But you set the agenda. You can call on anything you like, within reason, of course. Phone 0345 6060 973 or text 84850 or tweet to LBC or email alec@lbc.co.uk. This is the Alex Salmond phone-in with Ian Dale. LBC, leading Britain's conversation.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ian.
I'm surprised you got here with all these protests around today.
Well, they're all over the place, but I came by London black cab, as you know.
Yeah, because you don't like the other people.
No, because the other one didn't turn up that you sent.
Just what was going on, though, in the Commons? There was a big disability campaign there. It slightly got out of hand, didn't it?
Well, it didn't. I mean, the folk in the wheelchairs, who'd obviously organised a protest probably about the personal independent payments before the climb down following Ian Duncan Smith's resignation. They were all in the central lobby and they were trying to get through to the chamber in the wheelchairs. They were storming the members' lobby. And, of course, quite rightly, the police formed a line and stopped them getting in. I don't mind it. That's the job of the police. What made me slightly uneasy, I was speaking to some of the demonstrators, and they said they'd been held outside the Commons for over an hour in their wheelchairs. Now, it's not the coldest day of the year by any means, but I'm not certain about holding people outside the Commons unreasonably. You've got to remember the central lobby of the Commons was the place which, in the days before social media, where any member of the public had the right and expectation to go in and meet their Member of Parliament, come what may.
And not everyone knows that you can still do that.
You can still do that. And, obviously folk email now by vast majority, and we've got a vast number of emails, but you can still go into the central lobby of the House of Commons, you put in a green card, the Sergeant at Arms staff will go and try to find your Member of Parliament, tell them to come and meet you as a constituent. This may not be the most efficient way to canvass your MPs, but everybody has the right to do it. And it was a noisy protest, but it was a peaceful protest, and I was quite uneasy about people being left out in the cold. Now, obviously security is important. Obviously it's important to protect the chamber itself. That's the job of the Sergeant of Arms staff and the authorities. And I was sitting actually in front of the Sergeant of Arms, so I was getting a running commentary on what was happening right through Prime Minister's questions. But I was slightly uneasy about the idea of people with disability getting held outside the Commons for so long.
If there's anyone listening who was on that protest and would like to phone in, the number 0345 6060 973. And don't forget that you can watch us live on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk in glorious HD. Let's go to our first caller.
Our first caller is Imitaz from Shepherd's Bush.
Hi guys, thank you for having me.
Not at all, on you go.
Yeah, so my question to you, Alex, is, with what's happened in Belgium, often we talk about increasing security, but that doesn't really tackle the root of the problem. And because we don't do that, it affects, let's say, Syrian refugees might be blamed. What do you think are the root causes of what happened in Brussels and just generally what's happening with this? And what case do you present in terms of dealing and tackling this sort of extremism? Because often it happens from not Syrian refugees, but first, second, and even third generation European citizens.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Imitaz. I mean, there's actually a lot of common ground on what the root causes are now. The root causes are, as Tony Blair himself has acknowledged, the destabilisation of the Middle East, the forces that have been unleashed as a result of that destabilisation, and secondly, the alienation, which affects some countries more than others, of substantial sections of the immigrant community who are then ripe for radicalisation. And it's that twin issue of the destabilisation of the Middle East and the radicalisation of alienated sections of immigrant communities. And therefore, the task now is to tackle this. And undoubtedly, the most important thing, beyond any security measure, all of which can be required and necessary, but the only thing that really is going to matter is how you stop people being radicalised, how you stop people being drawn into the terrorist nexus. And we've had more success in that in the UK than they have had in Belgium, but not as much success as perhaps in some other countries. And I mean, for example, Theresa May in the Commons today was making a statement about Belgium. And quite rightly, she said, we express total solidarity with the people of Belgium, as you should at the present moment. She went on to say the seven foiled plots that our security services have stopped were the result of what she termed as Daesh-inspired or connected to Daesh publicity terrorism. In other words, they were homegrown plots of people influenced by propaganda, as opposed to Daesh sending an operative over to Shepherd's Bush and telling them to create mayhem.
But Imtiaz will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think what he's saying is what's different now, because whenever there's a terror outrage, we express our condolences. We look at what we think the root causes might have been. We sort of mop our furrowed brows and think, well, what do we do now? I mean, nobody is suggesting a change in strategy as a result of this, are they? There doesn't seem to be any new ideas.
Well, I've suggested one or two changes in emphasis. I mean, for example, I think if we realise that propaganda is a major element of this battle, we should be devoting at least as much resources to propaganda as we're doing to pursuing military action. I mean, for example, if you wanted you could take a squadron of people to take down every Daesh website for the cost of one of our super bombs. And we have the wrong emphasis, in my opinion, in terms of what we spend our money on, because the real danger is the radicalisation, and that's what you've got to... Now, it's not enough just to intercept Daesh propaganda, of course. You've got to deal with underlying cause. And, of course, it's rightly been said, in Brussels, for example, there's a largely North African community who are much more susceptible to the influence of Daesh propaganda than many, for example, of the immigrant communities in the UK.
Well, maybe, but
all communities are susceptible if you have large numbers of alienated young people.
But in Belgium in particular, I think there's been a massive failure of intelligence. The Belgian intelligence services don't seem to be up to scratch compared to ours. Now, Mick in Southboard has texted in saying, smaller countries don't do intelligence right. Look what happened in Belgium. What would happen to MI5 and MI6 if Scotland went independent?
Well, Scotland would have better intelligence, incidentally. And the reason you have better intelligence is you've got contacts with your immigrant communities.
The MI5 or MI6?
Well, look, there would be... Well,
sorry, are you seriously saying that from the word go, Scotland would have better intelligence services?
I'm saying we'd have a better intelligence service and handle because we've got better relationships with our immigrant communities, because intelligence is only worth the information.
Better than in
England?
England?
Yeah, yes, we have. And England is better than Gellam. Yes, we have, absolutely. Look, the issue is this. Let me tell you a story about the attack on Glasgow Airport. I was just in as First Minister. I was on my way to Glasgow Airport to make a declaration which was of fundamental importance, because I had to tell people, look, the people who had attacked Glasgow Airport, as I'd been briefed by then Strathclyde Police in a total briefing, I was told that these are people who've been in Glasgow a matter of weeks because they were part of a terrorist cell which was going to attack London, okay? So I went to make a statement, and the key point I had to make, these are people not from the Scottish community. Why did I have to make that point? Because you want to stop actions taking place as a result of people being targeted in a general attack on immigrant communities. I got phoned up by Jackie Smith, who was the Home Secretary, who said...
Just in the job.
Just in the job. And she said, you cannot go and make this statement. And I said, why not? She said, because you're revealing intelligence and security information. And I said, well, Jackie, my briefing was from Strathclyde Police, and last time I checked, they were under the jurisdiction of the Scottish Government, so I'm just going to go ahead and make the statement. Now, that statement and what followed, which was a visit to the Central Mosque in Glasgow with all of Scotland's religions, was fundamental in keeping society together in the face of terrorist attack. The information sources that we have from our immigrant community are better than they are in London, but London is better than you have in Belgium.
So you don't agree with me that MI5 and MI6 are doing as good a job as they could? You're saying a new Scottish intelligence agency actually would be more effective in Scotland?
That, because your intelligence is only as good as the information you're given. Why did the Belgium Security Service have such difficulty? They've had terrorists for the last 5-6 months fleeing Paris, living in a district of Brussels without the information of where they were, and only in the last few days try to grab them. That couldn't happen in Glasgow. I don't think it would happen in London, incidentally, and congratulations to the security service in foiling the 7 plots. But what we've got to understand, the real danger is the radicalisation of our communities, and the danger to intelligence is not getting the information and trust from your immigrant communities to allow the authorities to act.
OK, Imtiaz, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's move on.
Now our next caller is Edward in Barnet. Edward, on you go.
Hi, Alex. I wanted to ask, why do you think Western governments continue to turn a blind eye to the regimes that are funding terrorism? And what will it take for Western governments to start standing up to them?
Well, I think you've got a very fair point. I mean, the chairman of the Select Committee in Foreign Affairs last week made a very good point in the Commons when he turned his attention to the Turkish government. Now, I don't think you could say that Turkey is funding terrorism, but certainly they've been turning, at best, a blind eye to oil sales which have been going across the border.
Well, that's indirectly funding it.
Which is indirectly funding it. And I thought that was an excellent point to make. And obviously some of their treatment and behaviour towards the Kurdish people is totally unacceptable, not to mention the closing down of newspapers and the free press.
So why does David Cameron want to let them in the EU then?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. I mean, I
You wouldn't?
Well, no, because I'm in favour of European Union expansion. But I think in order to be in the European Union, you should conform to certain human rights obligations. And I think closing down newspapers puts you beyond the pale, however convenient it might be to make a short-term deal as a patch-up solution to the migration crisis. But of course, the other thing that Edward is probably referring to, and you can tell us, Edward, is the behaviour of Saudi Arabia in the Yemen, for example. Is this a...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's definitely been touched on and came out in the leaks, the leak scandal, was how Saudi Arabia, their donations constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what's happened, I mean, obviously, as you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran are in a great competition to be the regional power. That has involved the proxy funding or supporting of groups by extension. In the case of Saudi Arabia, either Islamic fundamentalists or perhaps via various circuitous routes to Daesh. In the case of Iran, of course, the Hezbollah and other militias. And it's really important that in addressing these questions, we don't attack some countries, like Iran, and turn a blind eye to the activities of other countries, like Saudi Arabia.
But what would you actually do? Because there are obviously big diplomatic problems here, because Saudi Arabia has traditionally been a big ally of this country, and we might not like a lot of things that the regime does. But what concrete measures can you take? Now, it's been suggested, one, for example, you could stop foreign funding of religious institutions in this country. You could stop these Wahhabist mosques getting all this money from Saudi Arabia.
Right, can I be more practical? Let's stop selling them arms. Let's stop selling the Saudis armaments to conduct illegal operations in South Yemen. And as far as the general things concerned, let's embrace more wholeheartedly the embryo peace process that's starting to take root in Syria and get people round the table. And let's accept that very few people, if anyone, in this particular fight has clean hands. And stop trying to pretend that everybody we're supporting is whiter than white and everybody else is blacker than black. I mean, there is one enemy here who are beyond the pale, and they're called Daesh. The rest have interests which must be negotiated and accounted for in the peace process if we're going to be successful.
But there is evidence that in some of these Wahhabist mosques there is radicalisation taking place, or at least they're influencing it. Would you not agree that we should follow Austria and actually ban Saudi money from coming into these mosques?
Well, you have to ban the objective. You can't ban the money by nationality. You can't assume that every Saudi investment is illegitimate. You can ban the purpose of funding if you can establish it. But listen, I have to say that, I mean, Theresa May be many things, but she's certainly no shrinking violet as far as these things are concerned. And if she had the evidence to support
she is when there's billions of dollars involved.
Sorry? So she probably
is when there's billions of dollars involved, and it would compromise huge amounts of arms contracts, and it would compromise other intelligence that we get regarding potential terror attacks in our own country.
So, Edward, what you're suggesting is that the Home Secretary would, because Saudi Arabia are a major market for British arms, turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia funding of that could go to inspire terrorist organisations. Is that your thinking?
Yeah, I believe. Not in this country. If it protects our country and it protects our principal allies, I think that she would be on board with turning a blind eye, not acknowledging, publicly or privately acknowledging what they're doing, but turning a blind eye to it. Absolutely.
Right, well, I'll tell you what I think, Edward. I think the government are turning a blind eye to what Saudi Arabia are doing in Yemen. I don't think that Theresa May or any other government minister would turn a blind eye to inspired money for terrorist activities, because to do that, of course, would be the end of any ministerial career, far more spectacularly than the end of Ian Duncan Smith's career. Nick Collins.
Well, actually, before we go on to the next caller, just one other point on this. Donald Trump has been wading into this debate. Your old friend, he did an interview with Piers Morgan this morning.
Stuff.
Let's just hear a little clip of him.
It's like they're protecting each other, but they're really doing very bad damage. And they have to open up to society. They have to report the bad ones. And, you know, if you report the bad ones, all of a sudden you're not going to have the kind of problems. So there's something going on. And I would say this to the Muslims and in the United States also. When they see trouble, they have to report it. They're not reporting it. They're absolutely not reporting it. And that's a big problem.
Now, I think you saw this interview. I certainly did. What did you make of what Donald Trump had to say?
Well, that clip you just played is about the most rational thing I've heard Donald Trump say in the entire course of the campaign. Where I think he's wrong is not accepting that the non-reporting of extremist activity is a matter for government as well as communities. You know, it's a matter where you've got to meet people halfway. I mean, most human beings, for example, are not terrorists, are not terrorist sympathisers. Most human beings don't want to have terrorist sympathisers in their communities. So if you get obstacles that prevent people divulging information, it means there's a breakdown in communications. Now, one way you can get a breakdown in communications is if people make statements like, all Muslims should be banned, or all Mexicans might be rapists, as Donald Trump has done. So I think, you know, that Donald should acknowledge his own role in the breakdown of communications. The difficulty I've got with it, I thought it was a pretty softball interview from Piers of the Donald. But one thing that interests me is this. If you look at deaths, I mean, 38 people killed in the carnage in Brussels today, that's appalling. But in mass shootings in the United States of America in 2015, those 475 people were killed. That's appalling. Not one of them was in a terrorist mass shooting. Most of us, including Piers Morgan incidentally, might say that's got something to do with gun laws in the United States and the provision of weapons. So how come Donald Trump, if he's very concerned, and he's entitled to be concerned about the casualties and the deaths that occur from terrorist incidents in the continental United States, which are relatively few after 9/11, why is he not concerned about the carnage which takes place on a daily basis as a result of the liberal gun laws? And why didn't Piers Morgan press him on that contrast today?
Well, we may well ask him if we speak to him in the next couple of days. Now, don't forget, you can watch Alex and I live at lbc.co.uk. And if you want to put a question to Alex, 0345 6060 973.
And next call is Matthew in Birmingham. On you go, Matt.
Hi. One of my main concerns is the radicalisation of young people. So my question is now the time to start talking to the media companies about how we actually report such events and also show propaganda videos? Because aren't we just playing into their hands by the way some papers and television stations actually report such videos?
I think there was a legitimate question. You know, when Daesh proved pretty adept pretty early in their emergence at using social media to place on online their propaganda videos, and I think initially there was an almost here's a video of an appalling thing happening, whether it be a beheading or something like that, let's show it. I think, to be fair to the media, they're much more circumspect about the presentation of these things now. And I would think, what I'd like to see is the authorities doing what Anonymous are doing. I think there should be the systematic dismantling of the Daesh means of communication. And I think that is at least as important as bombing Raqqa or the military action that is taking place. And I don't see that happening. When I questioned the Prime Minister on this sort of stuff and said, OK, he said, look, we're setting up a special unit. This is a few months back. The unit was about to be set up. So obviously I said, well, how many people, how much money? And answers came there none. So I'd like to see a lot more attention and funds. We can recruit very clever people, just as clever as the people who are working for Daesh, if not cleverer. And why can't we intercept their websites, as well as saying to the conventional media, as has been done, and I think to a certain extent it's been respected, look, these people, A, should be called Daesh, because, they are a terrorist organisation. They don't represent a religion or a state. It's a derogatory term that should be used, because that's part of propaganda. And secondly, they should be presented in the context of being a terrorist organisation.
We had a really interesting call yesterday from a teacher who said that she'd just been on a course that Ofsted had rung about spotting radicalisation at a very young age. And she said it was one of the most brilliant courses she'd been on. So something at least is being done to identify that in the schools. Right, you can watch us at lbc.co.uk. We've got a lovely studio here. We've got lovely guests with Alex. It's it's HD quality. So lbc.co.uk is where you need to
wrinkles.
go.
It's absolutely
there are
fantastic.
plenty of them. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call.
And our next caller is Malcolm in Norfolk. Malcolm.
No, it's not actually. It's Anne in Rochester.
Anne in Rochester. Sorry about that. On you go, Anne.
Hi, Alex. Good to talk to you. I'm a bit fed up about the appointment of Stephen Crabb. Now, I'm not usually a vindictive person, but this man who is in charge now of bedroom tax, working tax credits, disability payments. The only thing I remember about Stephen Crabb is that in 2009 he flipped his second home by very strange means. He ordered £500 goose down duvets and TV units.
You have been doing your research,
It
Anne.
certainly has, Anne.
Literally on the Telegraph website at the time.
It's the only reason you should consult the Telegraph.
Pounds on 3 rugs. I would really like to know how this man, who just a few years ago did all this, is now being given responsibility for the poorest in society. And I wondered what Alex thought about that.
Well, I should say in fairness that Stephen Crabb wouldn't be the only person who had to repay money to the Commons authorities. The Prime Minister was included that, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the former Prime Minister, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer a number of times. So he wouldn't be the only person in that category.
Weren't you glad you weren't an MP at that time?
No, I was an MP at that
were
time.
you?
I didn't have to repay anything. I was
Okay.
one of the few.
Just wanted to clear that up.
No, I'm delighted you asked
You're
me
a
the
saint.
question.
You're a saint.
No, I wouldn't say I was a saint. I just wasn't a sinner. That was all. In that case. But I think, we should judge this guy on what he does, right? And I think, he's now in as the Social Security Secretary. He's actually in for a secretary in the Cabinet in a very good position because obviously he's unsackable. I mean, it's bad enough to lose one Secretary of State. To lose 2 would be...
Well, that's what worries me, I'm afraid.
Well, to be fair, thus far, he's obviously used that influence of being the unsinkable Secretary of State for the time being, of saying no more cuts to disability in this Parliament, right? Now, you might well say, and I think a lot of my constituents would say, well, what about the cuts that have taken place already? What about these incredible sanctions that take place in people at the present moment? For example, if George Osborne had been subject to the same regime as many of my constituents, or in your area, and Rochester for that matter, then he would have lost his money on Monday when he didn't turn up to the House of Commons. Without a reasonable excuse as the sanction regime goes. So people might say that, but at least the circumstances of the Ides of March, of IDS's resignation, have put the new incoming Stephen Crabb Secretary of State in a strong position. So let's judge him on how he uses that. Will he use that influence that's been presented to him in order to represent, to campaign, to find an empathy with people suffering from disability, people in particular who are trying to work, which strikes me as the real engine behind the anger in all of this, or will he do as his predecessors and others have done and just let that drift away as an easy target?
Well, let's take another quick call on this subject. Anne, thank you for that. Claire's in Edgware. Hello, Claire.
On you go, Claire.
Good afternoon, Alex. I'd like to ask you, how disgusted are you that George Osborne has not apologised for the personal independence payments debacle? How is the £4 billion black hole now going to be filled? And should George Osborne resign?
Well, yes to the last one, absolutely. And of course, one of my young colleagues, Stuart Donaldson, asked a brilliant question today at Prime Minister's Questions. He read out the number of people the Prime Minister had expressed great confidence in, and then asked them, do you have confidence in the Chancellor of the Exchequer? People who'd resigned after.
That is a good question.
It was a great question.
Do you not think it's a mistake for Jeremy Corbyn, for example, to have called for George Osborne's resignation? Isn't the first rule of opposition only call for resignation when you've got at least a 25% chance of getting it?
Right. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think, and I have to confess, I was up inspecting a new bridge in my constituency that had something to do with when I was First Minister in terms of getting it built. I think on Monday, the opposition missed a great trick. When George Osborne refused to come to the House of Commons, they should have sat there and demanded his attendance. This is a Chancellor who'd presented a budget last week which was undone, as was rightly said by Claire. A £4 billion gap had just appeared in it. And I think the opposition MPs would have been fully in their rights to say we shall not be moved until the Chancellor of the Exchequer comes and accounts for himself. Instead, and it was a very weak presentation, incidentally, from Jeremy Corbyn on Monday. Instead of that, they let George Osborne sit slinking away somewhere, working out how he would present himself on Tuesday. Now, that doesn't seem all that important, but actually the momentum in politics is a very, very important thing. So I thought the opposition missed a trick by saying we shall not accept a Chancellor of the Exchequer rewriting his budget and sending some minion along to explain what's happening. Claire, I'll tell you how I'd fill the gap, incidentally. The increase in allowances for the top rate, the doubling of the allowances, which is effectively a tax cut for people who are rich in society, that should be scrapped. That should have been the first thing to go. And to be fair to Ian Duncan Smith, when he presented his letter, he said it was a juxtaposition of the disability cuts with the tax cuts for the better off, which made the budget unacceptable.
Do you think IDS was an honourable man?
I do, actually. I know that people will be listening to this saying, how on earth can you think that, given all the things he's done? I think, however, and I don't think it was anything to do with Europe, incidentally. I accept him totally in that, and that's why I think he's honourable. I think he's been misguided in many of the things he's done, but I think he was trying to achieve an objective, and it was when he saw it, and he'd obviously gone along with this disability cut, I think, disgracefully and badly, and he shouldn't have done it. But it was when he saw, and he wouldn't see this till last Wednesday morning, that this was to be juxtaposed in a budget which was going to cut tax for the better off.
But he didn't say anything in the cabinet meeting. That's what I don't get.
Well, I think, George Osborne notoriously thinks that Ian Duncan Smith's something of a dunderheat. Is not the brightest match in the box of matches. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I would think he was obviously biding his time and nursing his wrath to keep it warm. And let's be fair, when he eventually got round to writing his letter on Friday, it was a bit of a thunderbolt. So, Claire, I think what I would say is that should be filled by cancelling the tax cuts for the better off, and they should cease this assault on people with disabilities. And yes, George Osborne, of course, he should resign. And I think he got through the House of Commons this week, but in the much bigger and more important jury, which is the people in the country, I think George Osborne's still in deep doo-doo.
Just on Jeremy Corbyn, Angela in Edinburgh asks, has Corbyn got more friends in the SNP than he does in Labour? Where would you be on this Labour list? Would you be core group positive? We should just explain that for our listeners who aren't aware of this. In Prime Minister's questions today, I think David Cameron raised this Labour list that apparently Jeremy Corbyn's advisers have compiled to test each MP's degree of loyalty or hostility, and they've got sort of 6 categories. Have you ever made a similar list?
No, and if I wouldn't be daft enough to allow it to get to the...
It's very Nixonian, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it wasn't... the timing was dreadful. The government should have been on the rack. It gave Cameron an easy out at Prime Minister's questions. I would probably be on the more loyal side, because and I'll say it again, I've known Jeremy Corbyn a long time, and I think he's a deeply honourable person. I think he's been more right than wrong in international affairs. However, I don't think he knows much about the economy, and I don't think he is, in any sense, the sort of natural debater that you need at Prime Minister's questions if you're going to take advantage of great opportunities like the ones he's had this week.
So loyal but not core group positive.
Yeah, that would probably be me. You would be disloyal and off the scale.
I'm afraid I probably would. Who's the next caller?
And next is Malcolm in Norfolk. I've got here.
That's correct. Hello, Malcolm.
Malcolm, on you go.
Hi, Mr. Salmond. Hello there. Yeah, following the ease with which the Brussels terrorists, with their bombs and guns, freely moved around Europe, I am concerned now, with no border controls, that EU freedom of movement will allow these types of terrorists to just walk into the UK unchallenged and unchecked and commit similar atrocities. Do you share those concerns?
Well, we're not in that position because we're not in the Schengen agreement. The other thing I'd say to Malcolm is that I think if I were the Belgian authorities, and let's be fair, I mean, there's been huge failings in their intelligence and in their operations without any question, but it now appears at this site, and it's early days yet, that this is the same cell that attacked Paris. And in a way, of course, despite the 38 deaths and the carnage that's been caused, that is in a way quite comforting that it's not another terrorist cell. And it seems that the key people have been now rounded up. But I would be much more concerned about how people were able to live in Brussels over a period of months, having already attacked another major European capital, and with impunity. And also, of course, as you're probably aware, Malcolm, one of the failures of the system was that these people were actually stopped. They were part of the cell, were stopped on their way from France back to Belgium, stopped, and then allowed to go through. So these weren't a case of people not being stopped. These were capable of people being stopped but allowed to go through.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Quick text from Dave in Barnet. Boris Johnson says there are no economic arguments for staying in the EU. What's your message to Boris?
Well, I saw his bumbling performance in front of the Treasury Select Committee today, and I really would say go and do your homework, do a bit of research, and then...
He's not known for that, is he?
Well, possibly not, but I mean, I would advise anyone who doesn't believe me, thinks I'm prejudiced against Boris Johnson, go and have a look at go and have a look online at that performance. Nobody watching that performance would say that this was somebody who was destined for one of the great offices of state.
I mean, I watched that a bit as well, and my impression was that this was a man who didn't really believe in his case, and we all know that in the past he's never really been a Eurosceptic. Do you think this is all down to sort of political calculation?
Well, that certainly didn't help him. I accept that, because obviously the committee were quite legitimately casting up a number of speeches he had made in the past and saying, what about that then, Boris? But what interested me was he kept returning to this same answer. Now, you can get away with that once, twice, perhaps even 3 times, but, when the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, who does not bear fools gladly, gets to the stage saying, look, we're going to hold you in contempt if you don't start at least making a semblance of an attempt to address the question, then I think homework for Boris, kept behind class, made to stay in until he can do his work. Right,
short question, short answer next.
On we go. It's a question from Susan in Barnet. Susan.
Oh, yes. Hello, Alex. Very quick question. I'd just really like to know what you think about what Ray Moore and Novak Djokovic said about women's tennis this week. And don't you think we're all going a bit too far? We're now not even allowed to say we prefer one thing or another just because it's played by men or women.
So basically, do male tennis players deserve more money?
I think there should be equality, and I think Billie Jean King and the others who fought for that fought a great battle, and I wouldn't jeopardise that for a second. I saw the guy lost his job. I suppose I'm, the guy in Indian Wells. I'm the sort of school that says he shouldn't have said it. It certainly shouldn't happen. That women's tennis.
Well, why shouldn't he have said it if it was his view?
Well, I don't think he should say it. He's a tournament organiser. He's an organiser not just of a men's tournament, but for a women's tournament. He wants people to come and play in his tournament and feel valued for all of these reasons. He's not representing. Okay. He's not in the back of a pub somewhere. He's meant to be running a tennis tournament, so he shouldn't say it. I think it's a bit far to lose your job for just being an idiot.
Right.
So I think he's an idiot, but probably should have kept his job unless he says more idiotic things.
We could talk about that probably for the rest of the hour, but we're not going to, because that is the end of this week's Alex Salmond phone-in. Alex will be back next week, but we have Sir Richard Branson joining us in about 10 minutes' time, so do stay tuned to LBC. This is LBC. I'm Ian Dale. It's 4:36. News headlines with Ros Unwin.
A physics student has been convicted of plotting to kill soldiers, police officers and civilians in a series of Islamic State-inspired drive-by shootings in London. A court heard Suhaib Majid from West London acted on the instructions of his old school friend Tariq Hassaneh. He admitted conspiracy